everybody, and welcome to this episode of Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe with me, Emma Turner, and my co-host, John Hutchinson. Welcome, John.
Hello. Thank you for having me. I feel like I've won some sort of a raffle, and the third prize was to come and co-host Mind the Gap. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here.
Oh, when you said won a raffle, I was just thinking of my mum's WI raffle, where it's like a dusty box of Maltesers as a prize. I'm hoping you're not seeing it as that, but welcome. And I'm absolutely delighted, John, because we have got what a kickoff for a first guest to talk about. If we're going to start at the beginning, we might as well start at the very beginning of education with the wonderful Julian Grenier, who is obviously an expert in all things early years. So welcome, Julian, and thank you for coming on.
Oh, well, thank you. And yeah, it's so nice to be here. I was a bit worried that you were going to say like you'd won the 8th prize in the raffle, and as a result, you had to speak with me. But I'll do my best to kind of keep on the raffle theme and hope the Maltesers are fresh and crunchy today. Nice to meet you both.
Oh, thank you so much. I am absolutely delighted to have you on. We haven't had on yet an early years guest, so you are flying the flag high for all things early years today. And I do think that, I mean, I'm absolutely delighted to see that early years seems to be standing more front and centre in conversations around education at the moment. I don't know whether that's because I've curated my feeds for it to be like that, or whether you feel, in your expert's opinion, that it is kind of having a resurgence and a moment in the public domain.
I think we're definitely seeing exactly what you've just said, really, which is that, of course, we've known for a really long time how important this phase is, and how much rests really on quality and early years provision for children. It's definitely gone up the agenda. I think that may be partly because of the cohorts of children who have really struggled because of COVID-19 lockdowns and cost of living crisis. And we're very aware of the needs of lots of children coming through. And I guess that's balanced with a sense of just how important this phase is. So let's hope it stays front and center, like you've just said. It's such an important part of the system.
It really is, and we were just talking off air about the importance of that investment in early education and the impact that it can make. And I know that we've got quite a broad listenership. Not everybody is involved directly with early years. So it'd be really interesting to hear from you, Julian, just to kick off about what the potential impact of investment in really, really quality early years can be, and what the impact of that can be later on.
Yeah, I'm delighted really to share that. And you're right, there is a mountain of evidence out there, an absolute mountain, to tell us the potential benefits of investing in early years, by which I mean that combination of early childhood education with childcare. So sometimes we'll just see a discourse around childcare, helping parents get back to work. But when I'm talking about the evidence, I'm talking about childcare that's integrated with early education. In other words, yes, it could well be beneficial to working parents and to family life, but we're also holding the child at the heart of the whole process. This is something that is for children's benefit. So OECD recently have published yet another one of their reports about education around the world, and again have made the point that investment in high quality early childhood education and care is what all high performing systems should be doing. And why is that? Well, we're really lucky in England, and I'm saying England because this is devolved, that we've got the Ep85 project, which is one of the world's biggest and best longitudinal studies into the impact of high quality early education and care. And what we know from Ep85 is that high quality education and care benefits all the children who attend, so quality matters, but it benefits children facing disadvantage the most. So children who are eligible for free school meals are benefited even more by early childhood education than all children are. And we also know from the EPSI research that high quality early education is associated with lower levels of special educational needs and disabilities as children go through schooling. And again, we've seen some of that message reinforced in the recent IFS report, which looked at the impact of Sure Start local programs and looking at that phase one of Sure Start, which had high quality early education at its heart. Those Sure Start children benefited from the program. Disadvantaged children benefited even more. There was a higher identification of special educational needs in the early years in those Sure Start program areas, but associated with a lower level of EHCPs in secondary school. So we see that the system benefits, but most important of all, it's the child that benefits. It's about making sure that a child's background doesn't become a barrier to how well they're going to do in school. And early years is where the action is for making that difference.
John, does this chime with your work that you're doing? Because you've got quite a big kind of umbrella role, haven't you? Which covers everything from, is it 2 to 18? The work you're doing.
Right from antenatal in utero, I think absolutely. And Julian, what you've said chimes with what the team in Feltham have seen and heard from parents and families, which was often that they felt like they were getting the least support in those first 2 years of a child's life, and yet we they know how critical that kind of period is. I'm really, I guess one of the things that I'm really interested in, Julian, if it's okay, is you mentioned the sort of international comparisons, and it seems with early years we often do reach to other jurisdictions, other countries, and sort of say, if we just did our early years like them, then things would be better. Do you think that there's much validity to that sort of a can we sort of just take the education bit or the childcare bit of sort of earlier years work in other countries? Is there stuff to learn, or is it more difficult to do that?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually, because I think the simple answer is yes, there's definitely a lot to learn from other countries around the world. So, for example, we might look at the fact that our early years workforce, by international comparisons, is not as well qualified nor as well paid as workforces are across the world. You might look to Denmark, for example, with an all-graduate early years workforce. So there's a lot to learn from countries that have invested heavily in early years. But I think the second part of your point is also really worth pondering, which is that you can't just take something off the shelf from one country and implement it in another country. You know, we are where we are with the development of our services here in England. There's a lot to learn internationally, but I think kind of crude comparisons and any idea that we could just take something that's been done somewhere else and just implement it here, they're probably not as helpful as people think they are sometimes.
And I know that you've worked a lot in sort of early years settings, early years inspection, early years advisory. What are the things that you think, Julian, that are going really well within the sector? Things that we can really build on, that are real successes at the moment?
Yeah, I think it is a sector to celebrate for sure. So for example, it's very common for local authority teams to say that the biggest uptake for any professional development they offer is often in the early years. You've often got those early years members of staff who are incredibly passionate about their roles, really committed to each child, often develop fantastic partnerships with parents, really good and strong relationships. So there are so many strengths in the system that we have. But I think it's also true based on the kind of fairly extensive contact I've had over the last decades with practitioners on the ground, that a lot of practitioners are feeling it pretty fed up, to be honest, with how difficult it's been, and that there isn't that wider professional or public understanding about how important their work is. You know, just if you pull some of those facts out, like the fact that, you know, none of us will ever learn as much again as we learned between the ages of birth and 3 years old. We're not going to have another 3 years like that. It's phenomenal how important that phase is. And yet, often in the wider population, amongst teachers of older children, senior leaders, many of whom may not have any early years experience, it's not necessarily so well understood.
Mm. That's something that I could get on my soapbox about this for hours.
I'm fully expecting
Don't
a homily here from it's good.
unleash the beast. Don't unleash it. Well, I think that point about the rate of development between 0 and 3, between birth and 3, and as we've alluded to as well, the in utero learning that goes on as well, doesn't sometimes command the awe, the absolute awe and reverence that it deserves, really. And it can be seen sometimes or be perceived by some people that because teachers of older children are teaching more complex content, that potentially that's more challenging than working with children who are dealing with less complex content, but a really rapid rate of development. And I don't know whether you feel sometimes, Julian, I might be putting words in your mouth, feel free to correct me, that reverence and that awe isn't necessarily seen as professionally challenging or as difficult as it actually is.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, really. So the work early years practitioners do is important, but it's also complex. It's emotionally complex. Managing the very, very strong emotions that, say, 2-year-olds bring into an early years setting every day, managing those, helping those children grow and develop. That's really skilled, complex, and also, frankly, exhausting work. And it is very important, I think, exactly to reflect just what you said, that we should really value the staff that do that day in, day out.
There's an irony there, isn't there? In that a lot of what's become more fashionable in terms of evidence-informed practice within the profession more widely, and I'm glad that it has, around cognitive science, managing cognitive load, for example, optimizing load, breaking things into the smallest possible chunks, modeling, gradually fading guidance. These are, if you go into any early years classroom or setting in the country, this has just been bread and butter of the folks working there for decades. And I imagine, as you say, Emma, there must have been some eye rolling, given that it sort of feels like it's a, you know, we've discovered this and you need to do more of this in the early years, given that to me, it feels like, certainly when I've seen the very, very skilled practitioners within our nursery at Reach, for example, it seems like it's the purest kind of a demonstration of a lot of those principles around learning.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, but I think there's some sort of challenges around that. So we have sometimes seen people try to push principles from CogSci that have been derived from studies with much older children, or from lab-based studies, and we've seen attempts to kind of graft them onto practice with young children, and that's not a happy place to be, I think. So I agree with you that a lot of the principles of high quality teaching and learning are consistent no matter what age of child you're working with. You know, the old kind of Bruner argument, really, that that's the case when we think about human development, when we think about child development. It's much harder to get research evidence about young children of the same type as we have about older children, because you know, I suppose in the most basic way, children in early years, and this is why I love early years, they've not learnt a lot about that culture of being a pupil. So, you know, if I go into a year 4 class and I say, would you mind coming over here and reading from this book? Most kids will go along with that, even if it's not perhaps the thing they most wanted to do. Whereas really magnificently, a 3-year-old will just say no and carry on doing whatever it was they were doing before. And so therefore, the kind of traditional ways that we research with children by getting them to come over and do tasks or write things down or all the other things we do are much harder to do with children in the early years, where you need a much more bespoke one-to-one approach, researchers who are really skilled at working with young children. So for that reason, you know, the Education Endowment Foundation has, who I work for, has very much recognized that there are many evidence gaps in early years, and that lots of the research models we've got for older kids are not really appropriate for younger children. So I would strongly agree with you about that the more we find out, I would say, the more we've got this sense of consistent principles about high quality teaching, learning, care. But it is tough to get the caliber of research evidence that I think would really help the early years workforce.
I think that what you've said there, Julian, but as well about this, the kind of the child development angle as well, because children change and develop so much between sort of 0 to 5, you cannot just look through one lens of cognitive science. You've got to look through that developmental lens at the time. So you end up with like a layering of those lenses, don't you, of kind of what works for children at different ages. And I think potentially from colleagues that I've worked with more recently, there's a frustration sometimes that there's not a direct congruence between teaching older children what works with them and what works with younger children. It has to be different, and it has to look and feel different, not just because of the statutory elements of the framework, but also because little children aren't just smaller versions of big ones.
I think that again, that's such a very important point, and easily missed, I think, in a lot of the discussions. It really doesn't do young children a service to just water down things that you're doing with older children. But the other thing I'd say that can make it really tricky to think about the impact of what we're doing in early years is that child development in favorable enough circumstances is pretty fast paced. So the fact that a child is saying loads more age 3 than they were age 2, you know, it may reflect the fantastic job you've done as an early years educator, but it may also just reflect the natural pace and process of child development, children having that language explosion at that age. So we have to be really careful to balance our understanding of child development with our understanding of effective teaching and learning. And I would say where that plays out in the most important way is to think hard about the children who don't thrive and develop in those ways and really focus our efforts on that group of children, because that's the impact we need to make.
Is this echoing things that you've seen in your work, John?
So yeah, I think that what we're increasingly seeing is that focus on perhaps children experiencing disadvantage who are entering school, but also earlier settings with a whole host of barriers. Some of and many of those barriers, of course, are not kind of traditionally to do with the kind of the educational setting. There may be some, you know, speech and language sort of deficits, but there is just greater material poverty now compared to a decade ago, and that playing out in earlier settings, especially, and in classrooms. And as Julian, as you said at the top, the kind of the increasing gap of sort of needs that people are dealing with, and I suppose that leads to, if I can do the big question, which is we have this strange situation where the the EYFS runs from 0 to 5, and as you said, that working with a 0-year-old is very different to working with a 4 or a 5-year-old, and a bit of that is in school. The last little bit of it is in school, which means that we get this debate of, should reception be more like Key Stage 1, or should Key Stage 1 be more like reception and the EYFS approach? And you've spoken about that kind of child development not having neat kind of cutoffs, and it being a gradual and often rapid process. So this is my big question to you, Julian. How do we manage that kind of in your opinion, how would you manage that kind of easing into kind of the EYFS easing into school and the first few years of school?
Yeah, it is a really good question. So I think that curriculum continuity is important, and it doesn't do either EYFS or Key Stage 1 a favour to act as if they're kind of very separate things and neither should be kind of impacted by the other. We've got to be pragmatic that children after reception are going to go on into Key Stage 1, and to think about giving them a really positive experience of that. So I think hopefully these are kind of useful reflections, because I have visited quite a few reception classes and year 1 classes in the last few years and seen some really great stuff going on, but also some really concerning stuff. So I think the first thing I would say is that it's essential to do that curriculum prioritization in the reception year. So communication and language is really key. There's no point asking children to start writing sentences if they can't orally compose a sentence. It's vital that the focus on oral language development is a big part of the reception year, because we know that longer term, children with better developed language are also going to be better readers. They're going to have better comprehension. They're going to understand the school curriculum better as they move through school. I think similarly, the focus on personal, social, emotional development, I think can be pretty confident from the research that a focus in the early years on children's self-regulation and executive function, helping them to plan ahead what they want to do, keep on at it even if they find it difficult, monitor how well they're doing, not get too disheartened when things go wrong, but trying another approach. These are really important learning skills, and there is evidence about how to promote them, and we have it on the EF's Early Years Evidence Store, and that to me should also be a priority in the reception year. Children's physical development. Again, we've seen the really concerning rise in obesity. Children are less active. They're more likely to be overweight or obese by the end of the reception year. But better physical development is associated with better cognitive development, better self-regulation. So that focus should be a priority in reception classes too, and all wrapped around, of course, with that really important focus, I think, on understanding each child as an individual, that kind of loving care and nurture and support, remembering that the children are still little, lots of them are still 4 in reception. I think when we look at maths, the work that NCTM is doing around making sure that we have a mastery approach to maths, that we go slowly but deeply, make sure that every child is keeping up rather than skating quickly across a lot of content, so that some children already before even maybe their 5th birthday are starting to feel that number is hard and they don't understand maths and they don't like it. So I think we know an awful lot about the priorities we need for the reception year. And it's also fair to say that the EF's evidence is pretty categoric, that a focus on phonics, well taught, works for all children, but it works especially well for children who might face disadvantage. Then just very briefly, when we think about the move into year one, you know, the foundation stage, the early years foundation stage is foundational. And I think it's really important for year one teachers to understand if there are bits of the EYFS curriculum that a child isn't yet secure in, and that they use year one flexibly to make sure that all of the children are secure, that they've all got those strong foundations. And I think where we get it wrong is when we just think, well, they're in year one now, they've got to do these things. Because we know what happens when we keep putting children in a position where they can't do stuff. They get demoralized. They even more can't do stuff. And that, I think, is where we see those really big gaps growing between different groups of children.
I think that's so difficult for a year one class teacher, because as you say, you have 30 children in front of you, you might have a teaching assistant, and the breadth of kind of mastery of those areas that you've spoken about. There will be some children who can kind of sit at a table sort of all day, and I guess the temptation can be, well, because some of them can, then all of them should. But those that can't, those that aren't able to, are the ones that most need that kind of support to fill those gaps. So there's kind of a bit of a tragedy there of making the decision based on those most able, most likely to sort of do well in school in the first place.
Yeah. And if you're sort of blunt about it, and this is probably too crude, but roughly the English system does pretty well for most children, but it doesn't do well for what you might in data terms call the lowest 20%, the children who struggle with learning. They do particularly badly in our school system. And it is important, I think, that we focus our attention much more on the children who are struggling, make sure they get the extra help that they need, make sure that mastery approaches to teaching and learning are applied as they should be, so that all children move slowly and with depth through a well thought out curriculum, rather than having this kind of excessive focus on pace of coverage, which is really negative for children who might have low confidence or who might just be going through a phase where they're struggling in part of their learning.
One of the things that really surprised me in my work was, for the bulk of my career, for 20 odd years, I was based in Leicestershire. And when I started to work beyond the county boundaries, when I got a passport and was allowed to go beyond the edge of the county, I was so shocked, because in where I was working, most schools, because of the fact that we had mixed age classes a lot of the time, both cross key stage mixed classes as well, a lot of the classes would do a continuous enhanced provision model across key stage one. And I genuinely, for a very long time, thought that was what everybody was doing. And it was only when I went out and started to visit lots more schools beyond my local area that I suddenly saw this kind of wonderful play-based EYFS provision, and then lots of children metaphorically running into a brick wall and sliding down it in year one, because it became very formal very quickly. Whereas I was very used to being in this system where it was a gradual move from, I mean, obviously the provision didn't look the same in year two as it would in an EYFS classroom, but there was very much that approach that these children are still very little, they still benefit from a play-based curriculum, they still benefit from opportunities to revisit content, but in a more kind of child-led, curiosity-led approach, following some direct instruction. And I was so shocked when I went out and saw that that wasn't what was everywhere. And I didn't know what your thoughts were, whether you'd seen great examples of practice of that, whether that's something that you would advocate, wouldn't advocate, that you've seen work or not work, what your thoughts were about that kind of extended approach to play-based provision beyond the end of the foundation stage.
Yeah, I think hopefully a few thoughts on that are helpful. Excuse me. Hopefully a few thoughts on that are helpful. I think the first one is that supporting play-based learning is not as straightforward as people sometimes think it is. It needs really careful thought, really careful planning, highly skilled practitioners who know exactly what they're doing. So when it just looks like, well, we'll just kind of have a period of time where the children can just get on with whatever they want, it's unlikely to be as effective as it needs to be. The second thing I would say is that um, it's quite difficult to learn new things through play, but play is a great opportunity to, excuse me, sorry. Play is a great opportunity to practice, to repeat things that you already know, to try things out in new and creative ways, to do things with other children and develop those kind of flexible ways of working with others and thinking and solving problems together. So we have to think really hard about what's taught best through direct instruction, through adult guidance, through scaffolded learning approaches, and then what is it really helpful, useful, and enjoyable for children to develop and to learn as they play. A lot of people quote a really eye-catching statistic from the American researchers, Doug Clements, Julie Sarama, who talk about how children in their play use mathematical concepts every 30 seconds. And it's a great piece of research, and it's a great quote. But what is slightly missed out in that account is that these are children who are playing in a pretend shoe shop that has been set up by an adult with lots and lots of mathematical learning around numbers and sizes and how do you work out whose shoe is going to fit on whose foot, and an adult who's guiding that play all of the time. So we just have to be thoughtful about what it is we're trying to do, what the rationale is, how we can make sure it's as effective as possible. At its best, it's what I said. It gives children enjoyable chances to repeat, to practice, to do things in new ways, to be creative, and it's fantastic. When it's at its worst, the children who have lots of knowledge and skills bring that to their play, and that's really great for them. But if you're a child who isn't yet that confident about numbers or talking about shapes and sizes, and you're plonked into a pretend shoe shop, maybe you've never been in a shoe shop in your life, that's not going to be a great learning opportunity for that child. So we have to think hard about it.
I guess that comes back to this idea of the skill and the knowledge and the expertise that underpins really beautiful professional practice with younger children, isn't it?
It's exactly, and the real skill knowing when how to set up and create a play-based learning environment, when to intervene, when to let children take the play off in their own direction, when it's important maybe for the adult to put some guidance into the play so that children will learn what it is that you intended for them to learn. And there are loads and loads of reception classes. There are loads of nursery and childminder settings around the country with just those practitioners who think it through with a lot of care to great effect, but often not as well understood by people outside of the system as it needs to be. The complexity and the skill and the brilliance and the beautifulness of their work isn't always understood as it should be.
I remember taking a group of teachers to see a colleague of mine's school where their foundation stage setting is wonderful. I mean, it's just magical. It's in one of the most underserved areas in the region. All sorts of challenges in the school. And we took a group of colleagues there, and the EYFS lead, fairly early on in their career, narrated what the point of every object was in the room, what the purpose of every placement of everything was in that room, about how they structured their timetable in that day, why they did that 5 minutes there, and why the children had opportunities to do it. And honestly, the colleagues that I took there who weren't EYFS was absolutely stunned at the thoughtfulness and the expertise and the kind of the wonderful professional dance that was going on in what is essentially, if you didn't know that, would look like lots of children happily playing and some adults doing a few bits and bobs.
Yeah. It's hard sometimes to watch it and to understand what's going on. And I think, again, if I just put in a quick plug for the early years evidence store that the EEF hosts, one of the things we've done there is we've taken videos of practice and then we've broken them down into very short segments so that you can see, okay, this is where the educator is using this technique. This is where the educator is helping children connect with what they learned before. This is where the educator is encouraging children to come up with their own ideas, because otherwise it's hard and you end up just watching it and thinking it's lovely. And it is lovely,
Yeah.
but you need understanding as well as appreciation. And I think that's an important point to make. I guess the second point that what you said just prompts in me to sort of comment on is that it's the people that matter the most. So we can all be really wowed by a setting which has got a fantastic learning environment and brilliant resources and all very beautifully done. And I think social media hasn't necessarily helped here with the kind of perfect settings on Pinterest and Instagram, and we all feel terrible about what we're doing um, by comparison. And and you know, it is important to give children a beautiful environment, but way more important is what the adults do, how they relate to the children, how they talk with them, how they scaffold their learning, how they extend their thinking, how they teach them new things. And that can be done really well without a huge number of expensive resources. And it can be done really badly in highly resourced and very attractive settings. So it's always important, I think, to focus our attention on what are the adults doing? In what way is that extending a child's thinking, introducing them to a new idea, challenging something, developing problem solving together? What is it the adults are doing? That's where the real action is going on.
There's a lovely quote from Kathy Hirsch-Pasek, who is a psychologist at University of Pennsylvania, that leads a project called Playful Environments, sort of in the getting playful environments in the neighborhood, in the supermarkets, prompting families to engage in playful in play wherever they are. And she has this lovely quote, which is any toy should be 10% toy and 90% imagination. Which I was sort of reminded of when playing in the garden with my daughter, and she got a stick for a sword, fine, and she said, "Oh, we need a shield because the dragon's coming." And I thought, "Oh, what can we get for a shield?" Thinking I was going to go in and get a pot lid or something, and she picked up the tiniest little sycamore leaf and said, "Okay, I've got my shield." And in her head, that was enough. That was enough for it to act as the shield. Julian, you mentioned that that there are some gaps in the research around. You know, you've given lots of examples of really effective practice in the early years, but there are still some gaps, and because nature abhors a vacuum, those are often filled in with secondary heads or sort of saying, well, why don't you do this? What could you run us down from the EEF's perspective and from your own experience as head teacher? What sort of feel like the big gaps or the big priorities of it would be good to know more about this, or build the evidence base here?
Yeah. So I think the one that's particularly on my mind at the moment, because we're working on it, is around the early stages of children's writing. And it feels really surprising to say this, because you would think this would be such a central aspect of practice for us to understand, but it's not as well understood as we might imagine. And the research is a bit more contradictory and hard to put into practice than you might imagine. So I suppose if I just say a few things about it, is we know quite a lot about mark making and things we could do to encourage young children to make marks. And we know quite a bit about the physical development, which is important, so that children need to develop their kind of large muscles, their shoulder strength and coordination, and large arm muscles, but they also need to develop the small motor coordination, the kind of pencil grip, fingertips, So we know quite a bit about the stages children will go through in order to become dexterous at using a pen or a pencil. And I suspect that in many schools and early years settings, we skip a lot of that early development and just expect children to start writing before they've really had a chance to develop the predecessor physical skills that they need. But roughly, we do know what that progress looks like. But I don't think that there's been enough helpful and practical research about the early stages of children writing when we're teaching teaching them letter formation, where we're wanting them to write words. There's quite big gaps there. So we know about handwriting schemes. We know about how writing is sometimes taught as part of phonics instruction, but there's a real lack of focus, I think, on the distance children need to travel from that kind of mark making place to the place where we're wanting them to write letters that are properly formed, to use their phonics knowledge to write the correct letter and to spell words correctly. And so how I think that plays out is that children are often just expected to write things in reception without enough thought being given to whether they've got the predecessor skills and all the knowledge that they need. So I think that's an example of how something that's even quite a big part of the school system is not necessarily as well evidenced as we might imagine.
It's interesting about early writing, because I read somewhere, I cannot think for where, the life of me, where I read it, about if you design something to be one of the most cognitive demanding things for young children to do, it would be writing, because it's everything from correct seating position to pencil grip to correct pressure on the paper to remembering phoneme, grapheme correspondence and direction of movement and fingers. And it's like the most cognitively demanding thing for a young child to do is to turn these kind of sounds into accurate representations, which you produce physically accurately on the paper as well.
Yeah.
So it's an area I find absolutely fascinating, but also must be such an enormous hoop for children to jump through.
Yeah. And I think we probably all know that child who toils away in reception, their pencil practically ploughing through the paper and out the other side. And already by the time they've got to the end of reception, they find writing a struggle and a toil and something they'd rather not do. And if we sort of fast forwarded a couple of years, they'd probably hardly be any better at what they're doing. They've probably still got a TA sitting next to them, almost prompting them letter by letter what to put on the line or in the box of the worksheet. And I think that tells us that we're not thinking hard enough about giving children enough time to secure all of the predecessor learning they need, so that when they do come to this moment of writing a word on paper, they're not struggling with 5 or 6 different things like you so eloquently described. Those things are pretty automatic for them. And the struggle is the combination of all of them in the one act. So they need practice and to become fluent at that. But I think we just make it too difficult for children at the moment.
And that is a beautiful sentence upon which to finish. Julian Grenier, we just make it too complicated for children. I didn't want to finish though, Julian, without giving a little kind of flag wave to your newsletter that you put onto LinkedIn, because I dip into that and it is an absolute goldmine of information and updates about what's going on in the world of EYFS. So did you want to just say a little bit about it before we
Yeah, I'd really welcome that. So I think one of the reasons I joined the EEF was because I am really passionate about democratizing research evidence. So it leaves the sort of secret garden and becomes an area of practice that people feel confident to explore and discuss. But one of my sidelines personally is to put together a monthly newsletter on LinkedIn. It has 7 of the most eye-catching examples of research evidence that are being discussed in early years. So it's quite a quick read. just gives busy practitioners a brief rundown of what's going on in the world of research. And then there are the links to click if you're interested to find out more. And it's free. And I just love the comments and the comeback that I get. And I've learned a lot from that. So yes, I'd really urge people to have a look at that. And if you like it, sign up, let someone else about, tell someone else about it too.
And if you want to read more about your work as well, Julian, I know you've written quite a lot of books and publications, and they're all on your website as well, aren't they?
They are. And the best-selling book I've done, putting the EYFS principles into practice, is a free download, so you don't even have to buy it. You can just download the PDF. And I'm really proud of the book I co-edited with my partner, Caroline Bollins, putting the EYFS curriculum into practice, which is out there.
I can fully endorse all of them, but sadly we're going to have to finish there. So any final words from you, John?
I like you said at the start, it feels like there's a resurgence. We're at the start of a big national sort of conversation and prioritization of early years, and so lots of people will be curious. And so I'm just very grateful to have Julian to kind of kick that off and guide us through it.
Thank you so much for joining us, Julian. I hope you've enjoyed it. This is our first flight.
Yeah. So it's only going to get better from here. But no, it's been great to be part of this, and really grateful to have this opportunity. So John and Emma, many, many thanks. Great to join you.
Thank you, Julian. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to Mind the Gap. I'm Emma Turner, and I've been presenting with my co-host John Hutchinson. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave us a review, share on social media, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on our YouTube channel by searching Mind the Gap with John and Emma, or head over to Spotify for an audio version. This podcast was produced in association with Haringey Education Partnership, and our producer is Luke Kemper.